Good morning. So I want to welcome you all today and to thank you for joining us for this National Indigenous Justice Summit. This is a summit that is very badly needed, and I want to take a moment to thank all of the people who helped to bring this together. This was a summit that came together in just over the space of a week. And it was an informal summit in the sense that it isn't brought together by any one particular organization. But what happened was we realized that the situation for Indigenous peoples in the justice sphere was something that we really needed to turn our attention to. And one of the statistics that really drove our initial discussion, and perhaps this has changed by now, I don't know, but when we had started to plan, we were very aware that more Indigenous peoples in this country had passed as a result of police incidents than had passed as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic. And one of the things that we were very aware of as human beings was that we couldn't allow that to sit, that when we see injustices of that scale, that we are called upon, each of us, to act. And so I want to acknowledge the people who came together to make this happen and the organizations. Dr. Judith Sayers, on behalf of the National Tribal Council, who we'll be hearing from later today, was one of the key organizing forces, as was the Indigenous Bar Association, particularly President Drew LaFond and Nigan Azwakshin on behalf of the IBA, Trevor Bernard from the Member 2 First Nation, Doug White of the BC First Nations Justice Council, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, Testify Indigenous Laws in the Arts Project, Louise Mandel, as well as the Allard Law Professors Patricia Barkaskis and Emma Cunliffe. And I want to thank them. We're very lucky today. We'll have 3 panels today, each an hour and a half long, on 3 topics related to, first, relates to needed reforms in policing. And we are very lucky today to be joined by Marion Buller, who will be our keynote speaker. Good morning and welcome. Marion was led the national inquiry into murdered and missing women, which released its report almost a year ago, just over a year ago. She was also instrumental in starting the Indigenous First BC. Very lucky to have her, and I'd like to introduce her and ask her to speak first.
Thank you very much, Ardith. It's a pleasure to be here and to join all of you from the traditional unceded and ancestral home of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'm very honored to be a guest on their territory. I'm a member of the Mistawasses First Nation in Saskatchewan, but I live on the West Coast now. I'm going to speak to you this morning about the need for reform in policing in Indigenous communities in particular. And I have to say, when Ardith and others asked me to give this keynote, I thought, well, I can be very brief because my keynote will be one word. Yes, there's the need for reform. So I know we have to go past one word and dig a little deeper than that this morning. So today we're going to hear from distinguished speakers from a variety of backgrounds who are going to refresh our memories about justice issues with respect to Indigenous people. They're also going to talk about some solutions, as I will, and they will educate us about things that we don't yet know. The speakers coming up this morning are going to help us all focus on a direction forward. And I don't want to take too much away from them, so I'm going to speak in generalizations, and I'm going to hopefully speak quickly so there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to talk in a very general way about Indigenous communities, existing police services, areas for reform, and then I'm going to leave you with 2 challenges. And yes, there will be a test. So let's move forward. Let's talk a little bit about Indigenous communities, just as a review. We know that there isn't just one type of Indigenous community. There are reserves, settlements, hamlets, gathering places that stretch from the high Arctic to the downtown east side of Vancouver, Saskatoon, the north end of Winnipeg, Northern Ontario in flying communities, Labrador. We, as Indigenous people and our communities, go from sea to sea to sea. We live in remote areas. We live in rural areas. We live in urban reserves. We live in a variety of locations and circumstances across Canada. Some of us still manage to get out on trap lines. So what this means is that there's a great diversity in safety issues, community resources, cultures, languages, practices. There's not one size fits all. But there are a few things that all Indigenous people, all of us, all communities have in common. First, communities and individuals, as we know, have suffered from and still suffer from a variety of effects of colonization, be it the residential schools, the 60s scoop, forced sterilizations, forced relocations. The list goes on. Colonization impacts the lives of individuals, communities, cultures, and lands. We know that. We see that every day. And it also means, this diversity means, that we as Indigenous people need to feel safe in our own homes and our own communities. And we need to be respected and we need to be heard. Now, I have to say, these are not just needs. They are our rights as Indigenous people. There isn't just that Hollywood image of Indians anymore. We have to move past that. So let's turn now to police services across Canada. Again, there's a variety, great diversity here. Nationally, we have the RCMP. We have provincial police forces in Ontario and Quebec. And let's not forget the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. There's municipal policing in cities and towns. There are Indigenous police services. And I want to say right now, I'm going to talk about Indigenous policing separately. Even though these police services have different uniforms, perhaps different governance, they have different responses to diversity within their own organizations and communities, there's much that they have in common. First of all, they're paramilitary organizations. They use force for control and domination. They come from an us versus them beginning. But at the same time, they're the front line. They're the ones we call, and they're the ones that respond to mental health and other emergency healthcare crises. They respond to child welfare problems. They respond to environmental issues like flooding and fires. These organizations at the same time have resisted civilian oversight. And they have built all but impossible complaint procedures. Although their mottos for service may differ, police exist to serve and protect people. But what has happened over time, given the history of policing, that I know some other people are going to speak to far better than I ever will. The emphasis has been on protection. It's been on an us versus them foundation. Us being non-Indigenous versus them, Indigenous. This means protecting us, the non-Indigenous people, from them, the Indigenous people. This mentality, this foundation for policing, is colonialism and systemic racism at their best, or depending on your perspective, their worst. The emphasis on protection has led to over-policing and underserving, especially in Indigenous communities. During the course of the national inquiry, we heard from so many families and survivors across Canada that they have lots of policing, and in fact, in many cases, they have too much policing. They see members of their local police force more often than they see some members of their own families. They're on the first name basis with some police officers because they see them so frequently. But on the other hand, they're also underserved. We heard from families and survivors that police officers didn't believe them when they made complaints or made statements, that there was no follow-up on tips or leads that they gave police officers. Families and survivors said that they didn't hear back from police officers, as if they didn't matter. Their questions went unanswered, and their needs for safety went unmet. This was consistent all across Canada. So policing has failed Indigenous communities by ignoring the need to serve the community as the first priority rather than protection. But this doesn't mean that the community must adapt to the existing style of policing, which is paramilitary, as I've described. What it does mean is that policing must adapt at a very foundational level to the community it serves, be it Indigenous or non-Indigenous. But there can't be just mere tokenism or window dressing. This has to be a fundamental paradigm shift. There has to be power sharing and responsibility sharing between communities and police forces. This has to be a decolonizing approach to policing and public safety. And I'm going to come back to the decolonizing in a moment. I have to say, there is some good news. Some police forces, police services, I correct myself, across Canada are taking the beginning steps, the initial steps to make these changes, and they need our help and our support. Now, I said I would come back to Indigenous policing, and this is where I intend to talk for a few moments. I've seen, as probably you have as well, that many people are calling out for Indigenous policing as the answer to what we see in social media, the killing, the violence, the sheer brutality. So is Indigenous policing the answer? Well, I have to say, it's not for me to decide about policing in communities other than my own. But what I can say is what we did learn in the course of the national inquiry was, first, we must commend the existing Indigenous police forces or police services, I have to keep correcting myself, for the difficult work that they do. They serve flying communities, they serve communities that are suffering the most from colonization across Canada. However, the current structures, legislation, and policies undermine the very work that Indigenous communities want and need their police services to do. And that same structure, legislation, and policy undermines the work that police services Indigenous police services want to do and need to do for their Indigenous communities. Again, this is another sign of systemic racism when these Indigenous police services are mere delegated authorities. And I believe Professor Metallic is going to speak more to the issue of Indigenous policing, and she'll do a far better job than I can. So let's turn now to areas for reform for policing. And I'm going to go back to the work that we did for the National Inquiry, but this same or similar work has been done elsewhere. First of all, there has to be an emphasis on serving the community in a way that suits the needs of the community, because we know, or we have learned, I hope, that not one size fits all. So it becomes self-evident that there has to be the emphasis on service, which means there has to be new relationships. New relationships where police services do not alone determine the needs of the community that they serve. There must be equal partnerships between Indigenous communities and the police services, especially with women and 2S people at the table. I've always maintained that communities know their problems. Communities know their solutions, and communities know how best to implement those solutions. I know that power sharing is difficult. It involves fear, but we have to move past that. And here's an example of how power sharing works. Right now, in terms of policing, we have a pretty small, unstable, and leaking tent. Through new relationships between police services and Indigenous communities, we will build bigger tents, better suited to this particular environment, bigger tents that are stronger and include more people, and are better able to protect more people in a good way. So let's move past that fear and let's move towards action. We can talk about action, as I just have, and the need for reform for policing services in Indigenous communities in particular, but how will that actually play out? Well, in the work that we did in the National Inquiry, we found that there are 6 basic principles for reform and action, and I'll give them to you in no particular order. First, we, as Indigenous people and allies, must continue to hold all levels of government to account for justice reforms, especially in the area of policing. And by that I mean federal government, provincial and territorial governments, municipal and Indigenous governments. We need to get our own houses in order first, individually and as members of larger communities. And I'm going to come back to that. 3, this might be self-evident, but justice reform will not fall out of the sky and land on our laps. It's going to take work, and it's going to take some very uncomfortable conversations. But we have the courage and we have the will to move forward. Policing, as the 4th principle, policing reform requires new relationships, as I've stated many times, that are informed and equal, and that are decolonizing. 5, there has to be accountability to the community and transparency in action. These are essential in service. And 6, as I've already stated, communities know their own problems, know their own solutions, and know the best ways to implement those solutions. So let's turn now to challenges. And here's the first challenge. It's a test. It has to do with getting our own houses in order first. And I confess, I failed both parts of this test. Here's the first part. It's about policing in my own community. What do I know about it? As opposed to what do I think about it? What do I actually know? What are the facts? So, who are the police? And who's in charge in my own community? When I pick up the phone, who's going to respond? Do they have a website? Are there annual reports? Is there a police board? Is there an advisory group or a community safety group? Who is on the board or the advisory group? And what do they do? Do they do anything other than meet? Can you get minutes of their meetings? If all or any of this information is not available to you as a consumer, what are you going to do about it? Now, as an aside, you may also find that your local police service is doing some leading edge work in terms of decolonizing. And the question then becomes, are there advances being shared with the community and with the police services? Now, I thought I knew what would happen when I picked up the phone and hit 911 in the area that I live in. But I made inquiries. I read websites. I didn't know. I checked. I didn't know. I assumed that there would be advisory boards. There aren't any. Well, let me say this. Emails have been sent. And my goal is to learn with my local police services and to build new relationships with them in a decolonizing way. I failed that. How do you do? Do you pass those tests? Now let's move on to the second part because we're not done yet. The second part of the test is, what justice advocacy groups do you belong to or support? And if you don't, maybe you should. But if you do, what are these social and justice advocacy groups' agendas for police reform? Is there an action plan or an implementation plan for their agendas? If there aren't timelines for plans, should there be? Is there reporting back to membership? Is there transparency, in other words? If not, what are you going to do about it? Again, I failed that part, the second part of the test as well. But let me tell you, emails have been sent. So, all across Canada, during and after the national inquiry, we heard from Indigenous people and our beloved allies. What can I do? What can I do to make a difference? Well, first of all, you can pass both parts of the test I just outlined for you. But I'm going to give you the second challenge. The test was just the first. Here's the second challenge. As you listen to all of the speakers today and reflect on what they say, will you please start to make your own to-do list for justice reform, especially in the area of policing? Give yourself deadlines. Give yourself your own accountability. Because, as the poet June Jordan said, we are the ones we have been waiting for. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. A much needed challenge to each of us to engage with Indigenous policing where we're at. I want to take a moment now to introduce our next three panelists and to also let you know that we're leaving time at the end of this presentation to take questions. So you can enter your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. As well, to let you know that part of the presentation, preparation for this presentation was that there were students through Allard Law that went through all of the studies that had been done about Indigenous peoples and the justice system, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report to the Murdered and Missing Women and Girls Inquiry to RCAP, through a whole set of them. And one of the things that we were starting this is to try to say, what are some common recommendations that we see across many of those reports, and maybe we can use those as a starting point. So I would urge you, a link was sent to the 10 immediate action points. The first 5 of those cover policing. I'd urge you to look at those. And we're very lucky today to have 3 more panelists from across the country joining us, all I'm looking forward to hearing from them. So I'm going to introduce all 3 now, and then I'll invite them to speak one after the other. First is Professor Naomi Metallic from Listuguj, Mi'kmaq. She is both a practitioner of law, but also a professor at Dalhousie University. She was involved with the Canadian Council of Academics in a report for the Public Safety Canada toward peace, harmony, and well-being, policing in Indigenous communities. She's been involved in studying in this area, and I'm sure we'll have important information to share, both about the history of policing and thoughts for how we move forward. The second speaker that we will hear from is Dr. Judith Sayers is from Upakasath. She is the president of the New Chalmers Tribal Council, practiced in both BC and Alberta, and has a lot to say from, I think she's been assisting Chantal Moore's, some of Chantal Moore's family, but from a community perspective about the need for policing reform. And finally, we will be joined by Scott Robertson, Haudenosaunee Six Nations of the Grand River, who with Nawagabo, president of the part of his practice, including in police, including in inquests. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Naomi, and when Naomi is done, we'll invite Judith and then Scott.
Great. Gwe, Wildasi Begisin Giskuk. My name is Naomi Metallic. I want to thank the organizers, Walaliok, for bringing together this really important event and in such a short time frame, and especially Ardith and Judith and all the other people you've been working with. So I did decide to put together a PowerPoint presentation to walk through some of these issues. So we'll go immediately to the next slide. So as Ardith said, I was a member of the panel who wrote a report on policing in Indigenous communities in 2019. It is all available online, and I believe we put a link to it on Facebook. So I'm going to speak to some of the things that we found. Our key findings were consistent with several things that were said in RCAP and also the MMIWG report and other reports. And so we bring together a lot of thinking on several areas, including areas for change to Canadian policing practices. But where I want to focus on today in my short presentation is, I think, one of two of our biggest themes coming out of the report, which touch directly on the point 3 and 5 of the action points that Ardith referred to. So I've got them on the other side of the screen there. And so this is particularly the idea of redirecting funding and adequate funding and community-based policing. We also talk about, as I say, Canadian policing, but I think a real important focus needs to be on adequate funding for self-determined policing, because fixing the criminal justice system is not simply going to happen by indigenizing a colonial system, and that's been said several times by several different reports and people. For several decades, the Canadian government has recognized community-based policing, that it should play a role in policing Indigenous communities, but only half-heartedly. So that's what I want to talk about how that currently works and how that should change. So please go to my next slide. Just to give a little bit of a timeline or an overview, for a long time, Canada did see policing in First Nations communities as its jurisdiction, but not in a positive way. Police were used in colonizing the West, in administering the Indian Act, in administering residential school policies and laws. So in that early part of our history, for about 100 years, that was the case. But there was a change that started in the 50s and 60s, where Canada started to debate its role in Indigenous policing and started to say that the provinces had a greater responsibility to fulfill. This was consistent at the time with a position that Canada was taking across the board with respect to services to First Nations communities. They were trying to divest themselves of these services and trying to get the provinces to take it over. But also around this time, we have Indigenous communities that were to the opposite side, experimenting with their own policing solutions. The Canada did introduce through public safety as sort of the band constable program that was around for a while, and through bylaws and through also inherent jurisdiction, communities did experiment with tribal policing. In the early 90s, Canada finally put together a specific program called the First Nations Policing Program, which is what is currently in place and what I'm going to focus on. To address that sort of dispute, the way that the federal government and provincial governments agreed to this was that they were going to cost share the cost of policing to Indigenous communities, and they cost shared it 52 to 48%. An important point about this program that I'm going to talk about more is that, like other approaches that the government takes towards child welfare and social assistance in First Nations communities, it's a programming approach, which means there's no legislation that is specifically in place. What's done is there's a policy, and many of the mechanics are set in place by funding, by service agreements and funding agreements. Now, the rationale or the purpose of this was seen by Canada at the time as a means to support the implementation of the inherent right and negotiation of self-government. So there was some recognition of a role for self-determination, but as we're going to see, it was fairly half-hearted. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So to explain what is part of the First Nations policing program, there's essentially two parts to it, or there's two programs within it. There's self-administered policing, and then we have what's called community tripartite agreements. So some communities are in self-administering policing, where they have their own police force. They will also have their own police board as well. But as Commissioner Buller noted, this is still a delegated system. So it's not self-government as much as it is delegation. And these are done through agreements, and the police forces are bound to follow both provincial and federal laws. So in many ways, although communities are able to have their own forces, their hands are tied in many respects in terms of decisions that they would make. Now, the fact that we have our own Indigenous police forces that often will have police officers who are members of the community does mean that these types of police forces will be more focused on community-based policing. So let me now explain the second type of program that's available under this. So community tripartite agreements are not communities having their own police forces. Instead, it's a dedicated officer from the existing police force. So in most places, that will often be a dedicated officer of the RCMP. In some places, it might be a municipal force, but often it's the RCMP. The idea is that there's going to be a dedicated officer who has to spend 100% or a certain amount of their time in the community. They're supposed to liaise with the community. They are supposed to have advisory boards. One thing we found in the report is that often these advisory boards are often not set up. In some cases they are, but in many cases there isn't that advisory board, and so there isn't that connection. And because we are here talking about members of existing forces, often the focus is still on conventional law enforcement, or that sort of paramilitary approach that Commissioner Buller referenced. You know, this program, as I'll say going on to the next bullet, only 66% of First Nations and Inuit are under FNPP. So about a third of Indigenous communities are not within it. It does not apply to Métis or urban or off-reserve communities. And another important point is that the FNPP program has been closed for a long time. So who initially came under it has been able to access it, but communities who've wanted to have access to it after the 90s have been out of luck. Next slide. So this is just a graph from the report. The light purple shows you where there are First Nation police forces, self-administered police forces. As you can see, it's primarily only Ontario and Quebec, and a very, very few in some of the prairie provinces in BC. There are none in the Atlantic provinces. So yeah, a huge majority of those communities that are in the FNPP are CTAs. So essentially just a dedicated member of the existing police force. You know, in some places it's quite small indeed. So let's focus on New Brunswick. It shows here that 40% of the population has access to this program through CTAs. But in fact, that's only 3 out of 15 First Nations who have access. It's the 3 largest, that's why it looks like 40%, but only 3 out of 15. And the 2 communities where Chantal Moore and Rodney Levi were, Madawaska and Menabanagia, are not under the FNPP program. Okay, can I go to the next slide? So there's several problems with the program. I don't have time to go into them in much depth. I will just say, with respect to the self-administered, it's not real self-determination. Indigenous communities' hands are really tied even when they have their own police force. And the biggest problem that has faced these programs is chronic underfunding. Just like child welfare and other services, they are chronically underfunded. There's currently a couple of human rights complaints that are going before the Human Rights Tribunal. There's also a case based in fiduciary duty that's at the Quebec courts. About 58 of the self-administered forces, or 22, I'm sorry, have disbanded since the time that the program was created. And a lot of that has to do with the chronic underfunding, which has just made it so difficult for many forces to really operate. You know, officers are overworked. They don't have the capital or the facilities to really do their job appropriately. And when it comes also to the FNPP, the other programs, or I would say overall, it doesn't seem that this program is really meeting its mandate. Studies show that really it's a neglected area and understudied. And if the idea behind it was to have more Indigenous police officers, there's been a significant decrease in those numbers over time. As you see, with SA self-administered, it's gone from 86% to 59%, and with CTAs, 94% of officers used to be Indigenous, but now it's down to 25%. If I can go to a couple of my last bullets. So what are the solutions? So there's clear problems with the FNPP program. It doesn't achieve what it is intended to. And our solutions in the report are around this, essentially that Indigenous people need more choice. They need to be self-determining when it comes to their choices around policing, whether if that is their own force, that they need to have more options. And secondly, that these services need to be adequately funded. Across the board, that seems to be a significant problem. And you know, Indigenous police forces have been calling for the longest time for these services to be recognized as essential services, just like other policing forces, and that hasn't happened. And so that's a hugely important thing. We know that the federal government has recently announced that it is looking at a legislative framework in order to look at making First Nations policing an essential service, and also expanding the number of communities that have their own police forces. That has to be a self-determination model, not a delegation model, and it has to be done in full partnership with Indigenous people, and can't just be a one-time consultation. My last slide, I'm going to end real quickly on this, and that's to say, I think that can I go to the next slide? Yeah, so my last slide is that I also think there's a role for the provinces here. Both the federal and provincial governments have jurisdiction over their policing acts and can make changes that can be of benefit. And so if you look across the board at some of those slides, there are only a very few handful of provincial policing acts that actually do anything to accommodate or address needs of Indigenous communities. So there is a role for provincial governments as well. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Aklama Kakeanasuk Supachasuk Nuchanathat. My traditional name is Kakeanasuk. My English name is Jidasaris. I'm from the Hupachaset Nation in Port Alberni, that's part of the larger Nuchanoth. I am very honored today to talk to you about an issue that impacts all of us and has impacted others more deeply than others. And my heart goes out to all of those Indigenous people who have lost their loved ones at the hands of the police. We heard those stories last night, and we know how hard that was, and I appreciate you're willing to share so that we may more fully understand what you've gone through and why it is we all need to get out there and move and shake. I'm hoping to feel all of your shakes going on the work that you can do, because it's going to take all of us to make these systemic changes in policing. We all know there's a great need. We all know it needs to be done. We just have to ensure that those that can make those changes is able to do so. It's a basic human right and repeated in the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Rights that we all have the right to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of the person. Basic, we have the right to life, and many Indigenous people's right to life has been taken. We need to stop this senseless shooting and killing of Indigenous people, saying no more, no more. We must have governments walk their talk, and we have to get the entire public to care. And usually they only care if it affects their lives. So I guess we need for them to understand that this could happen to them. This could be something that could affect their lives. We have to reverse the effects of colonialism, residential schools, and intergenerational trauma in our communities. We need a unified approach. We need a holistic and informed approach to reverse all these effects, and leadership at the national level is needed to spearhead a countrywide movement and action plan to immediately address the failing relationship between the Canadian justice system and Indigenous peoples and individuals. And today, we're called together today to put all of our collective minds together and look at those recommendations that have already been made and add to them, bring them to the government and make them implemented. So I identify the issue that we're looking at today is, what does justice for Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, Colton Boucher, Brady Francis, and so many more look like? What does it actually mean? And I think that part of it is that we need to take action, implement things now, that no other person, Indigenous person, shall die from a senseless shooting. Actions will be taken to change the system. Wellness checks will be done differently, not with police, with trauma-informed teams. And then the problem, of course, is getting the government to walk their talk, because Prime Minister Trudeau, Bill Blair, Mark Miller, Commissioner Brenda Lucki have all said systemic racism does exist and we're going to change it. So let's give them an action plan and say, let's do it. You know, because they often flounder around and saying, well, we have to call Indigenous people together across the country, we got to consult, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, you can tell how much I think about their consultations. So if we can be prepared and ready and just say, hey, this is what we want, let's begin work on it. And then I think it will be so much better. We're dealing with systemic racism. How do we change that? We're dealing with the dehumanization of Indigenous people, especially women. And how do we make people value us as Indigenous people? This whole labeling business has got to go. We need, right now, the problem, of course, is that it's not Indigenous-led. We don't have the money, as Naomi elegantly said, and Marion gave us a great picture of what's going on. And so we need to lead in anything dealing with policing. We need to be fully funded by governments to do so. So some of the solutions I want to talk to you about today, I told you last night that I had approached and had a call with Minister Bill Blair, Minister of Public Safety, and I asked him, can we put in place a community task force of people that can outline all these recommendations and how they can be implemented? And he says no. Well, he didn't say no directly, but you know, he didn't answer me. And he says, no, I think the answer is in amending the Police Act, and I'm working with AFN to do so. I told him it's just too long. We need so much more. We have to find other solutions. But I didn't get any commitment from him. I also approached the National Chief and asked him for the same thing. Let's put together a First Nations task force, not a Chiefs committee. Let's just put us together. Let's work on this issue, provide a path. And I haven't heard back from him. So I met with Elizabeth May, Green Party, and she heard me. And she says, let me talk to some senators. Why don't we see if we come up with a Senate committee or a parliamentary committee? So this morning at 8:30 Ottawa time, Senator Kim Pate and Elizabeth May announced that they're putting together a parliamentary committee. Also joined by Senator Yvonne Boyer and supported by two MPs, Jenica Atwind and Gord Johns, who's from this riding, and Jenica is from Fredericton. And so that's, of course, where two of the most recent deaths happened. Problem is, of course, they can't start till September. That's when they are. But it's something. It's, you know, having the government look at it. If the ministers aren't going to listen to me, then you know, I'm happy that these other people are putting an action plan in place. You know, I jokingly said on my Facebook page this morning, there's more than one way to skin a deer or a moose or an elk, whichever's in your territories. So I think that that's an important step. It's one step, but there's many others. I would like to start our own citizens task force on this as well. I have one other name from the Levi family, and you know, like if other groups won't do it, let's do it ourselves. Let's pull, you know, a group of 8-10 people together. Let's start doing this work now. We can do this. We don't need an organization. We don't need the government. We just need to pull everything together that we decide today, and then start lobbying. And all of us can do that lobbying in our areas. So That's what I'm thinking about. And just narrowing this down to wellness checks. And there's so many areas to look into in justice and policing, as we've just heard from both Marian and Naomi, and excellent presentations. But this is one thing that I think if we just narrow it down, that no other person will ever be killed on a wellness check. I also mentioned this last night, but I think we need a whistleblower policy for the police, that they may freely go to their supervisors and talk about other officers that do racist acts, speaking, anything that could be racist, so that they can be called out. And also asking all those police officers out there, and I've known some really good ones, just to stop and ask the person to stop doing that behavior, stop speaking about Indigenous people that way. They need to be brave. They need to come forward. They need to talk about those things. The RCMP Act allows for campaigns on various issues. So let's ask them to start a campaign on respecting Indigenous women. Let's do a campaign to not call 911. But of course, we have to have in place some other teams that can go in. First Nations need a role in independent investigations. We need to figure out what that looks like. And I know that there are some recommendations in some of the 10 points that we gave, but I think that's important, because usually they go away and they do their thing and they don't really respond to the families. And Marian talked about the families who felt so frustrated because their answers weren't forthcoming. They felt things hadn't been properly looked into. And so how do we make that better? I think we really need to put in place community wellness teams, peacekeepers, however we want to do that. But let's make sure these teams are trauma informed. We all know the trauma that we've gone through. The police don't. Most police don't, I should say. So we need trauma informed counselors or other people. I have found out in some of my meetings that some police actually bring along social workers, or they bring along a mental health worker to do, but not everybody. And so how do we make that more frequent? How do we actually put in place some Indigenous trauma teams to do that work? And of course, this needs to be fully funded by the federal government. And Bill Blair told me very specifically that there's no money for such things. But I think this whole campaign that's going on to defund the police is going to help us. Let's use that impetus to help us get what we need and to put money where it should be. And of course, in our own lands, we need our own form of policing. Community teams, we don't have to call them police. We can just call them whatever. I know one of our Nuu-chah-nulth Nations was telling me the other day that their hereditary chiefs, their Hatwia, empowered their cultural warriors to be the enforcers of their policy on COVID, and using their own people to make sure that those viruses aren't spread. And there's so many other examples out there. Winnipeg, what is it called, the Bear Patrol or Bear Paw? I'm not sure, but let's keep using more models like that, implementing those things. And I really emphasize that when we send in our trauma-informed teams, that they don't have weapons. If there is ideas that there could be something happening, the police can wait outside, can be called in if and when they're necessary. But I think, that we can de-escalate situations. And we need to focus on crime prevention through community-based models. And in that way, we can be self-determining. We can figure out what that is. Like Marian said, we know the issues, we know the solutions. All we need is the time and the space to be able to do that. There's some long-term things that need to be done. We need to overhaul the whole policing system. Throw it out, let's start again. What is it we really need? The history of violence of the police, through residential schools, through all of the blockades and taking them down and arresting our elders and ripping up our red dresses has got to stop. You know, this is just so devastating and offensive to our people. And so we need to do with that. So anyway, there's so many more things that I would love to talk to you about, and loving to hear your ideas. You know, if you're interested in a special task force, send me an email. But, you know, I encourage each of you to go out, meet with your city council if you have city police, meet with your members of parliament, meet with your members of the Legislative Assembly or MPPs, whatever you call them in your provinces, because we have to change provincial police, municipal police, RCMP, so different jurisdictions. We need to look at off reserve, we need to look on reserve. So we need, you know, different solutions for the different areas, or maybe they're all one and the same, but you know, I think we just need to recognize that. And so again, I encourage each of you to move and to shake. This is our time. This is what we have to do now, and that's why we call this together so quickly. And we really appreciate those that have responded. I appreciate greatly the organizing team who came together and pulled us together. We can't do anything alone. We have to do things together. And with that unified voice, I know we can make these changes. You know, the times have changed, and Indigenous voices are stronger than ever. And so now what we need to do is to get change. Let's ourselves work, decolonize. Let's move together on this. And I really look forward to conversations today and hearing from the experts that we have already established. And thank you to all of you. And again, Martha Martin, who I'm the political spokesperson for, wanted to thank you for the opportunity that she's been given to participate in this, although she wasn't able to do that physically herself, but through me, and to have her story out there. And you know, we're working seriously for justice for Chantal. It's the last thing she said to her daughter, and she's going to live up to that. And she's a very strong woman, and I know she will do that. And I'm happy to be by her side and helping in any way. And I know that I can call on all of you for that help. So, Clayco, Clayco.
Thank you, Judith. I'm going to invite Scott Robertson to speak next, and also just to let you know, we've had a lot of requests for the PowerPoint and report that Naomi shared. We've provided those to the people who at Testify, who are managing the Facebook page, to the Indigenous Bar Association, and to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So I would check their social feeds. Those items should be up there shortly. Scott.
Thank you very much. My name is Scott Robertson. I'm a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And I just want to begin by thanking Ardith Walcom for your incredible strength and dedication, the organizers and the sponsors for today's wonderful program and thoughtful program. This is a real coming together of our people from across Canada, which I think is extremely important. So I would like to thank the creator for allowing us the safety and the space to gather today, and for the incredible sacrifices by those who have come before us and those whose work we build upon. I want to acknowledge the wonderful contributions of my fellow participants on this panel, Marian, Judith, and Naomi, incredibly strong Indigenous women who specialize in these areas, and for your contributions and the strength that you provide to us. And thank you for sharing your wisdom. It's an honor and a privilege to be speaking with you. I'd like to start by beginning and acknowledging the 10 immediate action points that have been shared in advance of today's summit. And I don't think we should underestimate the fact that these have been summarized in 10 points. This is a result of painful and very difficult inquiries as a result of actions against Indigenous people. And these action points are hard fought. And they come on the backs of inquests like Dudley George, the moonlight tours out in Saskatchewan, and many other horrible incidences involving Indigenous people. And that should not be minimized in a sense of there has been an incredible amount of time and effort, expense, dealing with the systemic problems that lead us to, our actions today in terms of calls of action. And so I want to recognize and I want to acknowledge that. I also would want to take a very special moment to acknowledge the families that participated yesterday. And as Judith had mentioned, it's incredible to see them sharing their strength and these very unfortunate and circumstances that bring us here today in terms of their journey. So thank you very much for that. And there has to be a learning lesson in terms of sharing those stories. So I just want to acknowledge that. So when we look at these 10 immediate action points, I think what we're really dealing with here is a call for the decolonization of the Canadian state. This is an incredible, daunting task, and it lies upon us as Indigenous people to take on that task, because as we can see from the 165 years of the state that's now, Canada, we're not going to get their support, and it's not going to be easy. So we're attempting to contend with the pervasive racism, and not just in police forces, but all levels of society. And this is a level of systemic racism. This is a societal issue that sees Indigenous people as being backwards, criminal, and a threat to progress and development. And I think it's important that we realize the context in which we enter this relationship. So the theme of the morning panel is the need for policing reform. And I would suggest that police reform is but the tip of the proverbial iceberg in dealing with these issues. And I'll bring an explanation to that. So for many Indigenous people in this country, the police are the gatekeepers for colonization. If you think about it, the colonial machine is often initiated by an engagement with police representatives. And this may come in the form of an arrest sometimes in the form of peaceful protesting, an arrest in the form of responding to a domestic abuse case, an arrest in the form of implementing an apprehension order, an arrest in the form of protecting your homeland or your resources or your rights in the form of fishing or hunting. The police representatives may come in the form of an inquiry or an interview. They may come in the form, as Judith has indicated, a wellness check, or even provision of a summons. Oftentimes, these are innocuous interactions between the police and Indigenous people that lead to tragic events. I would like to remind that all of these engagements are carried out by institutions which they themselves have acknowledged are performing and carrying out systemic racism. As we have seen, some of the results of these engagements result in fines and imprisonment. And just in terms of the fines and penalties that we see in police implementing in terms of these engagements, that has an incredible impact on Indigenous people. If you think about having a criminal record of any form, well, if you look at some of the most benign INAC regulations or laws or bylaws, having a criminal record will basically prevent an Indigenous person from even seeking some form of election or representation in their own councils or chiefs. That has a very lasting impact, all from that first engagement with police forces. Following that, if you now have entered into the criminal and justice system through an engagement with the police, you know that there are very many issues in systemic racism dealing with probation, parole boards. If you look across Canada, the representation on parole boards has basically almost no Indigenous content or representation. Remand and the provisions of remand and the provisions of release for Indigenous people often come in the form of trying to figure out whether or not they can find help with addictions and whatnot. And that also leads to an entire field of racism and systemic racism in those fields. You'll see sometimes that there's injuries obtained through these criminal justice provisions and whatnot, and engagements with police. And that leads you to a visit with the doctor or medical facility. And you can see through the Canadian Medical Association and the Dental Associations of Canada that once Indigenous people are entered into that stream, wait times are incredible. Visits with doctors are at a much lesser time in terms of spent with a medical professional than non-Indigenous people. And that also leads to all kinds of other issues and problems. Some of these engagements, as we have seen, result in the fostering or adoption of Indigenous children. Again, this is stemming from those initial engagement with police forces. And we know some of the horrible crimes that are committed on Indigenous children that are put into fostering and adoption scenarios. Again, this is a systemic racism that pervades and kind of spreads out from these Indigenous engagements with police forces. Crown prosecutions, when dealing with Indigenous people, you can see that Crowns will often look for stiffer sentences, or will proceed with sentences that they wouldn't also proceed with non-Indigenous people, and this is a huge problem. And then finally, for some people in their engagements, we have seen most recently result in the greatest result of all, I guess, unfortunate result is in deaths. And even in death, we see that Indigenous people are again systemically, there's a huge racism. If you look at inquiries in coroner reports of Indigenous people, oftentimes many things that would be more fully investigated with non-Indigenous people lead to some very poor results in terms of inquiries and coroner reports on how Indigenous people are killed or are found dead. And this, again, leads to dead ends for First Nations people. So what I would like to point out is that all of these engagements essentially are designed and result in separating Indigenous peoples from their land, their culture, and their spirituality. And we see in the findings of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report that this is a form of genocide. And this is the ultimate statement, in a sense, of when police forces are identified, and this leads to what we see as an act of genocide in Canada. This is shocking, and this is something that needs to be addressed not only by the government, but I would say all forms of our society have to address this. So while I'm not suggesting that the process of colonization is complete, and I would say far from it, I merely want to acknowledge the task at hand and the pervasive nature of attitudes, biases, prejudices, the ignorance, the lack of knowledge, and the fear that stands in our way. And I applaud the efforts of everyone that's involved in this, and anybody who's participating even online and taking in these presentations today, because I think this is a call to action. This isn't a call to listen. This isn't a call to provide yet another report on a library of documentation on this exact point. This is a call to say that we need to do more. We need to do more as a society. We need to do more as Indigenous people. And unfortunately, this burden falls upon us. And so while I'm very honored to participate, I'll be very disappointed if, following this summit, this very important and critical, I would call, summit, that we don't have an action plan that goes forward. And the fact that I'm already hearing that Judith is calling and we have a Senate committee being established, those are wonderful. But again, I think more of a grassroots approach. What can we do in our communities today, tomorrow, and the day after to ensure that we're protecting our Indigenous women and girls, that we're protecting our societies and our culture and our land and our resources? And that's what I'd like to see. So thank you very much for the ability to participate. I do very conscious of the time, because I see we have a bunch of questions, and I'd like to put on my facilitator hat, and I'd like to start to address those. So thank you for the opportunity to participate. So I would, if I'd like to, Art, if that's okay, I'd like to just address some of the questions that have come in, and I'll field these to the panel in general. But I'd like to start with the first question. So in order to be funded, Indigenous police services are required to come under the Provincial Police Acts, which do not recognize First Nations self-government and jurisdiction. The question is, how do we reconcile traditional ways of social control with contemporary rule of law as set out by the provincial governments? So I will put that to the panel, if I may.
Maybe all of our panelists can come back on board now too.
Sure, I can take a shot to start, and I think that was Dan Belgart's question, and I did respond directly to. I didn't, not necessarily on that one. Sorry, there was another one about jurisdiction, but I think that the law is always moving and changing, and we don't have to accept that just how things have been is how they always have to be. And I don't think it is the case that we necessarily have to accept that we have to be put under provincial or federal jurisdiction in terms of the types of models of policing we have to follow. It's a first reaction.
I agree with Naomi. I want to just pass along a little bit of my family history. I remember my grandfather saying, we always looked upon it as our failure if we had to call the police because we failed to resolve whatever the issue was in our own community. And so I've often said, well, do we really need the police?
Maybe I could just add, so yeah, I think if we can have those conversations in our communities and come up with those solutions of, eradicating violence from our communities, if there is any, or who's responding, when there's an issue, and using our own community first, if at all possible, to resolve that. We have so much in our traditional values that we can use, and I think making the most of it is going to be really important.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to pose another question that's been asked, and just to give some context about it. We've heard a lot about reforming policing. However, we also heard the core of policing and justice being about colonialism and maintaining control. Rather than reform, many have been calling for defunding and abolishing the police, and instead replacing the police system with alternatives designed intentionally to serve particular purposes. Example, mental health professionals versus police providing wellness checks. We also must be conscious that Black communities are also over-policed and murdered by police officers. I'm keen to hear from presenters on this and why they believe a system designed to control us can be reformed rather than reinvesting in building alternative solutions. So I'll pose that to the panel.
I could start that. I think that reform is not the best place to start by any means. I think in the interim, while we put our own systems in place, that we can make changes because right now that's what's affecting us. Colonialism is about power and control. And governments, police don't like to see that we can do that ourselves. And that's what we need to do, is to take that power ourselves and do what we can to change that. So that's why I say right now, in the interim, what can we do while we're doing the larger discussion about in our communities, and I hope every community is dealing with justice issues, policing issues, and doing the reform. We need to lead in those kinds of things.
Any other thoughts from our panel?
I'll add something because it's on the back of my head, and I don't know it's exactly in response to the question, but something I think that we should say. It is so important for our communities to be, taking back control over these areas. But one area that will always come up, though, and it came up in my presentation and others as well, is the money aspect. And it's something I didn't say as clearly, and I do really want to say it now, is that I really see these as fundamental rights, human rights, fundamental international human rights, the UN Declaration, and that we need to be pressing this as a rights conversation and not simply just a needs. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and in the MMIW report, this is an excellent job of drawing this highlight. We have a right to life, liberty, security, life, liberty, and security. We also have the right to be treated equally as individuals, but also as collectives. And, our people are not safe. They're not secure. And there is a fundamental violation of charter rights, not as well as international rights. And we need to be framing that as a discussion to put pressure on the governments to see that they have to, adequately fund these areas. This is not just a matter of budgets and if they want to, if it's convenient. So that's a real important part of that discussion. I just needed to get out.
I really can't add anything of value. The speakers are brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks. We have another question that I'd like to present to the panel, and the question comes in, it's quite simple in terms of the question, but maybe not in terms of the answer. So what is the role of the national organizations in addressing this problem?
If I can address that. So we do have a lot of national organizations, and I'm most familiar with the Assembly of First Nations. I don't know much about other organizations, but normally the AFN operates from motions from the chiefs. There has to be something mandating the national chief to act. So there are general motions out there to work on justice issues and I believe there's a Chiefs Committee on Justice. So the same with the BC Assembly of First Nations. So when issues come up like this, it's harder for them to react unless it falls within that mandate. But definitely we need our leaders to be speaking out strongly against what's going on. And so, like in New Brunswick, you've seen the chiefs come together to meet with the premier and to take action and to be vocal. We need that at the national level, we need it at the provincial level, we need it at the local level. And, we all have to be speaking out on these issues. This isn't acceptable. We have to keep saying that. We've got to change. Here's our solutions. Let's do it. So that's my feeling. And sometimes it's just a bit of too much bureaucracy for the AFN to react too quickly. I mean, obviously they make public statements, but doing the work could be a bit more difficult and finding the funding to do so. So they're just my thoughts.
I mean, I don't have too much to add to that. I agree that every, our national leadership should be speaking out. There are several other groups. We have an amazing now network of Indigenous lawyers across the country as well, and other groups. And, the more hands they are, the lighter the work is. And there's a heck of a lot of work to do. And, if we can support each other in moving that work along, I think, we're all our communities are stronger for it, and that's what we all want at the end of the day.
It's about building partnerships and developing new relationships and rebuilding relationships. From my perspective, I think that, as Judith and Naomi have already said, there's a role for national organizations to keep this at top of mind at the national level. But from my perspective, I think we really have to empower our own communities to make change, because that's where the best and most meaningful change is going to come.
Thanks, Marion. On that question, there's a very interesting one that just came in. So what might policing look like for policing in urban areas for Indigenous people? As we know, there's a fair amount of Indigenous people who live within urban areas, not within the communities themselves. What would that policing look like?
I can take an initial jump in at that. We do address this in the policing and the CCA report as well, that there has to be different solutions for different communities, the urban, and there are ways that our voice can still resonate, and still we need to see Indigenous people having a greater role in the governance of Canadian police authorities. So roles on police boards, roles in oversight and accountability and public complaints. Like, those are all places that we could put far more Indigenous people. I mean, those are things that are not that hard to accomplish, and yet there's so few of them. So I think that would be one way that is a form of self-determination if Indigenous people have a say and a choice in this. So that is certainly a model. Working with our friendship centers, I mean, that's a real easy one. Get in there and start, actually speaking with and learning about the issues through the friendship centers. 2 easy solutions.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think, working with whoever has jurisdiction, whether it's the city police, provincial police, RCMP, and proposing a unit of Indigenous people to act as in a policing role, such as the one in Winnipeg, or putting together and working with a trauma-informed team to go in on wellness checks, as I've spoke about, because I think this is really important. I also think that First Nations stepping up to the plate and offering services to train officers in Indigenous peoples, our culture, and how to deal with some of our trauma was also an important thing. I talked to one of the officers that I work with, until they transferred him, and he says that face-to-face relationships is really important. So knowing, finding ways to make ourselves human to police officers, I think is really important. Inviting them in the city, making sure that they know it's important. I mean, I used to walk into every single protest and say to the police, "Thank you for being here to protect me and the rest of the people here," because I knew they were there to watch us, to police us, to document us, take our pictures. But, they had to understand that they were there to protect us from those that are around us. And so those are the kind of communications you need to have, and just completely working on educating them. Some of these are simple and some of them are complex, but I think there's all kinds of exercises we can do in urban centers. And we need to do that because so many of our people live in urban centers.
Just to add to what Judith and Naomi have already stated, in the National Inquiry final report, we made several calls for justice that are directed specifically at urban policing. I note the time. I won't go into them in detail, but we did make a whole series of calls for justice regarding Indigenous policing.
Thanks, Marion. I just wanted to leave off. I know we're just about out of time here, but there were many comments that came in, not so much questions, but comments. And I just wanted to leave on a positive that many of the comments that came in were expressive of the local and community organizations and the policing programs that are in place, that communities are enforcing on their own and adopting and implementing on their own community. So there's much of that happening across the country. So I want to leave on a positive note that not as all bleak. And thank you for those comments and those wonderful insights from those who sent in their questions and their comments.
So I just want to take a moment as well to thank all of the panelists, and just to note that I think we can say that a rule of law that excludes the first people of Canada and excludes the first laws of this land is going to be fundamentally incomplete. And we need the answer in policing is to recognize and to re-empower Indigenous ways and to re-involve Indigenous peoples. And I think one of the things that we've seen from the discussion and from the incidents is we can't rely on good intentions, because I don't think people have bad intentions. And that's why some of the talking point recommendations were about the need for an Indigenous-led policing oversight body, the need for a national protocol when we have Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous women and girls or two-spirited people involved in incidents of violence, that there needs to be some sort of national protocol to address that, and as well a recognition that discrimination on the grounds of Indigenous identity should be recognized as a prohibited ground across the country. So I know we had a lot of questions. One of the things I wanted to say is I believe that the people over at Testify are creating a page which would allow for more public discussion, it'll be moderated. But there's a lot of questions that people had that we couldn't get to. You can move them there, and as we go through, we have panelists who are sharing presentations, who are referencing reports. We have a lot of partners, including the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the Indigenous Bar Association, and those groups are putting this information out on their social feed. So if you look them up, you should be able to find some of that there. And just before we go as well, so this panel's over. We're going to reconvene at 10:30, so people can stop. They can get coffee, take a break, and we have as well an amazing panel lined up at 10:30. We're having a keynote by the Honorable Stephen Point, and then we have panelists Emmy Kraft, Doug White, Joseph Murdoch Flowers. So again, Marion, Judith, Naomi, and Scott, I thank you very much for your words.